Hello, welcome back to Marathon Man, where I'm going through the history of James Bond, looking at every novel and film in release order, as well as doing various pit stops along the way to take a look at other media that may have come out in between. And you join me as we are going through the short story collection For Your Eyes Only, and we have just reached Risico. In the last video I said that of the unused Fleming titles that were left, once they did Casino Royale, I always thought Quantum of Solace was the shoe-in to be used. Not that I ever thought they would, I thought they were done with doing Fleming titles, but then they made Casino Royale and then they surprised me by actually using Quantum of Solace. But once the films used Quantum of Solace, of the unused Fleming titles that were still left, Risico was the one I thought was the most obvious. Now in the story itself, it's just a mispronunciation, but it still has a ring to it that's very Fleming and therefore very Bondian. So I know that an argument could be made against it, that because it is just a mispronunciation, there's no real meaning there at all. But I'd argue that there's as much meaning to Risico as there is to Goldeneye. Fleming made it up and then it was used and there was a reason retroactively put into the film. There was a Goldeneye. Risico could be a name, it could be an operation. I still think that Risico is ripe to be used should they want to. I mean, obviously, plot-wise, much of it is off the table, given that it was used to form half of the film For Your Eyes Only. And whenever I read this short story collection, I always actually am impressed by how deftly the film For Your Eyes Only managed to weave the two short stories together. Basically, if it was announced as the title for Bond 26, I wouldn't be upset. Not that I think it will be. Of course, there needs to be a Bond 26 announced in the first place. This is the fourth of the 5 short stories in this collection, and it's another winner, which makes this a really consistent book. There is action, which is written with Fleming's usual verve, and there is a really great plot twist that we as fans can forget is even a plot twist given our familiarities with the films. And like many fans, I did consume the films first. As a kid, they were really exciting, and the prospect of sitting down to read stuffy, boring grown-up books didn't really appeal. Now obviously that wore off as I grew out of kids' books, but because I'd obviously watched the film first, I was well aware when reading Risico that Columbo was going to turn out to be an ally and Christatos was going to turn out to be the villain. Reading this not knowing that is a luxury I will never have, and so this time I decided I was going to try and pay more attention to how Fleming sort of sets that up and pays it off. And he does it pretty well. I think maybe even if you weren't familiar with the developments of the film, then you could probably still maybe guess that Christatos isn't entirely on the level. He has certain traits which Fleming describes enough that Bond's suspicions are present, even if they are low-key. And he even mitigates this with Bond acknowledging that what he's engaged in is risky business, which is even the source of the title after all. So when it does transpire that Christatos is indeed a wrong-un and Columbo is, well, still a wrong-un, but just happens to be working towards the same interest as Bond in this particular instance, it doesn't come as a complete shock. But given the confined space of a short story rather than the leisurely paddock of a full novel, Fleming still does it quite well. Reading this one and For Your Eyes Only has me quite keen to get to the film, and once I stare that feeling in the face, I realise I've got a hankering to get to the films in general. Now that doesn't mean I'm wishing away the Fleming books, not at all. It's just that with the Bob Holness Moonraker radio play being lost to time, the 1954 TV version of Casino Royale is really the only instance on this marathon so far where we've seen Bond through a lens that isn't solely Fleming's voice. And it's a great voice, I'm having a great time, and like I said, I'm finding this short story collection particularly engrossing this time around. But the variety of Bond through those different lenses is creeping ever closer, and I'm beginning to get excited. And the films are fantastic, obviously. But when those films began deviating hugely from Fleming's plots, like You Only Live Twice and Moonraker, and at Fleming's own behest, The Spy Who Loved Me, reading Risico, it's really quite compelling how faithful stretches of For Your Eyes Only is to it, and For Your Eyes Only was obviously made after those earlier films, so the fact that it hews that closely to Fleming and essentially goes back to Fleming basics, that's really interesting. Now, it's on record as that's how they felt they had to go after the excesses of Moonraker. But the fact that they did that is, one, I think, laudable, really glad that they did it. And two, it makes for an arresting read, because if you are familiar with the films before you read the books, which is, like I said, the case. I read the Fleming books when I was a teenager, and an early teenager as well. But obviously I'd seen all the films that were out at that point. When you are familiar with the films over the books, and I still like the films I know far better than the books. I've read the books several times, I've watched the films way more. When you read Risico, when I read Risico this time, the faithfulness of the film For Your Eyes Only to it sort of slapped me about the face a little bit. To return so strongly to Fleming again is a reminder of the character's origins. And it's always rewarding when the films do that after a certain period of time. So for example, the attack on the warehouse at the end of Risico, it's like it's just translated from the page to film. Feels so much like the sequence in the film that it makes for quite a thrilling read for a couple of reasons. I mean, first of all, it's written incredibly well and very evocatively, but it also has an extra warmth to it because of how faithfully the film adapted it. Yeah, okay, there it resulted in Locke being killed, and here it's the demise of Christatos, but the sequence in the film does feel lifted straight out of the book. And Roger Moore in faithful Fleming is something we got all too little of. So this climax manages to surpass the one in the For Your Eyes Only short story, making Risico the strongest of the short stories so far. For Your Eyes Only still felt like a complete story, where I didn't feel From a View to a Kill did. But where this one has the edge on For Your Eyes Only is that yes, it does feel like a complete piece, but it's also that bit more exciting as it goes on. My eyebrows always raise when I get to the scene where Columbo tells Bond of Christatos' true nature and the real relationship between the two men. Like, I don't know how many times I've read Risico, but I always seem to forget the extent of Columbo's operations, and that might be because, like, Topol's adorable performance always manages to push that memory out. There, he still admits to being a smuggler, yes, of gold, of diamond, of cigarettes, of pistachio nuts, but no heroin. And from there, he's a lovable character and probably one of the best allies in the entire Bond film series. Here, the sentiment remains, and he still draws the line at drug smuggling, but he quite happily admits to a bit of sex trafficking as well. But Fleming continues to write him as affable as Topol's portrayal would later be, and it calls to mind his treatment of Darko Karim in the novel From Russia with Love. It gives Columbo an edge, for sure, but stops him from being truly likeable. And maybe that's Fleming's intention, of course, but not knowing for absolutely sure always has me doubting a little bit. Like, at best, being kind, Fleming is pointing out that the complex characters that Bond will come across in his travels through this murky underworld will obviously possess vastly different standards and principles from what we used to. At worst, though, Fleming doesn't see trafficking women as bad as smuggling dope. I'm inclined towards the former, obviously, but not knowing for sure always has me wondering. But for Columbo to be a character that movie audiences of the early 80s were going to root for, the producers were probably wise to substitute smuggling women for pistachio nuts, although that probably only adds fuel to those eager to pour criticism on the films for how they view women. Bond producers view women as valuable as pistachio nuts. Like From a View to a Kill and For Your Eyes Only, Risico was one of those unused plots that Fleming devised for a mooted 1950s James Bond TV series. And if these short stories, along with the stretch that Anthony Horowitz used for his novel Trigger Mortis, are anything to go by, then I think that TV series probably could have been something quite special. Not that I'm mourning its loss, though. The way things worked out means that we get these short stories plus the film series, which is easily the better deal. But returning to the point I made at the beginning of this video about the thrill of viewing James Bond through different lenses. Man, what would I give to get a glimpse into the parallel universe where the TV series got the go-ahead. The climax as the warehouse is raided. Columbo's willingness to smuggle women and his transparent frankness about it does jar quite a bit. Again, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this double cross, then you know how YouTube works. Please do give it a like and spread the word. It'd be great to get as many Bond fans along for the Supermarathon ride as possible. And what do you think of this one? Can you see why it was adapted so heavily and faithfully for the films, or as a Bond adventure, is it weak sauce? Do you think the title is ripe to be used for a future Bond film, or is it ridiculous even by Fleming standards? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you back here soon for Murder by Fish. So if you don't want to miss that, hit the subscribe button, bong the bell, and I'll see you in the Seychelles.